The moment I opened my mailbox and saw the $2,500 fine from the Homeowners Association, I knew they had picked the wrong fight. What they didn't know was that I had just been sworn in as the Regional Zoning Commissioner 3 weeks earlier, and I had been waiting for exactly this kind of overreach to make my move. By the time I was done with them, that cedar fence around my chicken coop would be the least of their problems. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. My name is Grace Martinez, and until 6 months ago, I was just another resident of Willowbrook Estates, a sprawling suburban development that had mushroomed out of what used to be prime farmland about 20 Raid, miles outside the city. I had moved here 3 years earlier after my divorce, seeking the kind of quiet suburban life that promised fresh starts and peaceful evenings. What I got instead was a front-row seat to the most petty, power-hungry homeowners association I could have ever imagined. The trouble started innocently enough. I had always wanted chickens, ever since I was a little girl visiting my grandmother's farm in Iowa. There's something deeply satisfying about collecting fresh eggs each morning, about the gentle clucking sounds that drift across a yard, about the simple connection to the food you eat. When I finally saved enough money to build a proper chicken coop in my backyard, I thought I was living the suburban homesteader dream. My 6 hens, Henrietta, Clementine, Petunia, Rosie, Daisy, and Buttercup, became my pride and joy. Each morning before work, I would step out onto my back porch with a cup of coffee, watching them scratch and peck around their run, their feathers catching the early morning sunlight. They were more than pets to me. They were a symbol of the independence and self-sufficiency I had fought so hard to achieve after my marriage fell apart. But suburban chickens, as it turns out, have natural predators beyond the usual hawks and foxes. The neighborhood cats had discovered my girls, and what started as curious stalking quickly escalated to full-blown hunting expeditions. I lost Buttercup first, finding her mangled body one morning near the fence line, her golden feathers scattered like tragic confetti across my freshly mowed lawn. The sight hit me like a punch to the gut, and I knew I had to act fast to protect the others. That's when I decided to install the fence. I did my research carefully, calling 3 different contractors and getting quotes for various materials. Cedar was the obvious choice, not just for its natural resistance to weather and insects, but because it blended beautifully with the mature oak trees that dotted my property. At $800, it wasn't cheap, but it was an investment in protecting my remaining hens and creating the kind of backyard sanctuary I had always envisioned. The installation took 2 days. Miguel and his crew from Precision Fencing worked efficiently, setting posts and attaching the smooth cedar planks with the kind of craftsmanship that made me proud to write the check. When they finished, I stood in my backyard admiring their work. The fence was exactly 4 feet high, as specified by the county zoning code I had looked up online. It was set back the required 3 feet from my property line. Most importantly, it created a secure perimeter around my chicken run without blocking the view from my kitchen window. For 2 blissful weeks, life was perfect. My hens strutted safely around their expanded territory, and I could finally relax when I let them out of their coop each morning. The cedar had already begun to weather to a beautiful silver gray that complemented the natural landscape. I had even started planting a small vegetable garden inside the fenced area, imagining rows of tomatoes and peppers that my chickens could help protect from pests. Then came the letter. It arrived on a Thursday afternoon in mid-September, tucked between a credit card offer and my monthly electric bill. The envelope bore the official letterhead of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, and something about the weight of it told me this wasn't going to be good news. I opened it standing right there at my mailbox, and what I read made my blood pressure spike instantly. "Dear Ms. Martinez," it began in that overly formal tone that bureaucrats use when they want to sound important. "It has come to our attention that you have installed a fence on your property without proper approval from the Architectural Review Committee. Furthermore, the cedar material you have chosen is not in compliance with the approved materials list outlined in Section 4.2b of the Willowbrook Estates Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions." End quote. I had to read that sentence twice to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Not in compliance with approved materials? I looked up from the letter toward my fence, wondering if somehow I had been looking at the wrong structure for the past 2 weeks. Nope, still cedar. Still beautiful. Still perfectly reasonable. The letter continued with increasing absurdity. The Architectural Review Committee has determined that only pressure-treated pine or composite materials are acceptable for residential fencing. Within the community, your cedar fence constitutes a violation of community standards and negatively impacts property values throughout the development. End quote. Negatively impacts property values? My fence looked like something out of a home improvement magazine. It was the kind of upgrade that real estate agents would highlight in listing descriptions. But apparently, according to the fine print at the bottom of the letter, the Willowbrook Estates HOA had determined that my beautiful, professionally installed cedar fence was such an egregious violation that it warranted a $2,500 fine. $2,500. For a fence that had cost me $800 to install. I walked slowly back to my house, reading the letter a third time to make sure I wasn't missing some crucial detail that would make this make sense. But no, there it was in black and white. I had 30 days to either replace the fence with approved materials or pay the fine, with additional penalties accruing at $100 per day after the deadline. That evening, I spread the HOA covenants across my kitchen table, a document I had skimmed but never thoroughly studied when I bought the house. The covenants were 43 pages of dense legal language that seemed designed more to confuse than clarify. Section 4.2b, which dealt with fencing materials, was buried on page 27 between regulations about mailbox colors and restrictions on outdoor storage. The approved materials list was indeed there, specifying pressure-treated pine or composite materials only. But as I read further, I discovered something interesting. The covenants had been written in 2006, when the development was first established. The materials list reflected what was readily available and cost-effective nearly 20 years ago. Cedar, which had become increasingly popular for residential fencing due to its sustainability and aesthetic appeal, wasn't even mentioned, which suggested the list hadn't been updated to reflect current market options. More importantly, as I continued reading, I found several references to compliance with local zoning ordinances. Section 1.3 clearly stated that all HOA regulations must comply with county and state zoning laws, and that in cases of conflict, government regulations would take precedence over HOA rules. That's what I remembered, something that made me smile for the first time since opening that ridiculous letter. 3 weeks earlier, I had been sworn in as the regional zoning commissioner for our county district. It was a position I had campaigned for over the past year, running on a platform of sensible development policies and protection of property rights. My background in urban planning and 15 years of experience working for the State Department of Natural Resources had given me the expertise. But it was my frustration with exactly this kind of HOA overreach that had given me the motivation to run for office. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. I spent the next several days doing research that would have made my old college professors proud. I pulled county zoning records, reviewed state statutes regarding homeowners associations, and compiled a comprehensive analysis of fence regulations throughout our district. What I discovered was both fascinating and infuriating. Cedar fencing was not only permitted under county zoning ordinances, it was actually encouraged as an environmentally sustainable option. The county's own environmental guidelines, last updated just 6 months earlier, specifically mentioned cedar as a preferred material for residential fencing due to its natural resistance to decay and its renewable harvesting practices. But more interesting was what I found when I pulled the property records for Willowbrook Estates itself. The HOA had been approving violations of their own covenants for years, apparently when it suited their purposes or involved the right people. Mrs. Henderson at the end of Maple Street had installed a wrought iron fence around her pool area, despite iron not being on the approved materials list. The Johnsons on Oak Drive had put up a 6-foot privacy fence that exceeded the 4-foot height restriction by a full 2 feet. Most tellingly, the HOA president's own property featured decorative stone columns flanking his driveway, made from materials that weren't mentioned anywhere in the covenants. The pattern was clear. The HOA selectively enforced its rules based on personal relationships and, frankly, who they felt like picking on at any given moment. They had gotten away with it for years because most residents either didn't have the time or expertise to challenge their authority, or they simply paid the fines to avoid the hassle of fighting. But I wasn't most residents. The monthly HOA board meeting was scheduled for the first Tuesday of October, just 2 weeks after I received the fine. According to the covenants, residents had the right to address the board during the public comment period, with a 5-minute time limit for individual speakers. I marked the date on my calendar and began preparing what would be the most important presentation of my career. The meeting was held in the community center, a bland conference room that smelled like stale coffee and floor wax. When I arrived at 7 o'clock sharp, I was surprised to see nearly 30 residents in attendance, far more than the usual handful of die-hard community activists who normally showed up to complain about barking dogs and overgrown lawns. I had dressed carefully for the occasion, choosing my best navy blazer and heels, the kind of professional outfit that commanded respect in government meetings. I carried a leather portfolio containing printouts of county zoning codes, state statutes, and property records that I had organized with color-coded tabs. But most importantly, I carried my official zoning commissioner identification, still crisp and new from my recent swearing-in ceremony. The HOA board sat at a folding table at the front of the room, looking like they were playing at being important officials. There was Margaret Whitman, the president, a woman in her 60s who had moved to Willowbrook from a much more expensive neighborhood and seemed determined to recreate the rigid aesthetic standards she had left behind. Next to her sat Tom Bradley, the vice president, a recently retired insurance adjuster who approached HOA regulations with the same nitpicking attention to detail he had presumably brought to claim investigations. The secretary, Linda Porter, was frantically taking notes on everything, as if the minutes of this suburban meeting were destined for the presidential library. I waited patiently through 20 minutes of routine business, reports on landscape maintenance contracts, and discussions about holiday decoration guidelines. When Margaret finally announced the public comment period, I was the first to stand. "I'm Grace Martinez," I said, approaching the front of the room with the confident stride I had perfected during my years of presenting at county planning meetings. "I live at 427 Birch Lane, and I'm here to discuss the fine I received for my cedar fence." Margaret's expression immediately shifted to what I can only describe as smug satisfaction. She had clearly been looking forward to this moment, probably expecting me to grovel or negotiate some kind of payment plan. "Ms. Martinez," she said in a tone that suggested she was addressing a wayward child, "the Architectural Review Committee has already reviewed your case thoroughly. The cedar fence on your property is not in compliance with our community standards, and the fine reflects the seriousness of this violation." I opened my portfolio and pulled out the first document, a copy of the county zoning ordinance that I had highlighted in bright yellow. "I appreciate your position, Mrs. Whitman, but I think there may be some confusion about which regulations actually apply to residential fencing in this area." The room got very quiet. This was clearly not the response they had expected. "I've spent the past 2 weeks researching the legal framework that governs property improvements in this development," I continued, "and I've discovered some interesting discrepancies between your covenants and the actual laws that supersede them." Tom Bradley leaned forward, his face already flushing red. "The HOA covenants are legally binding agreements that every resident signed when they purchased their property. You agreed to abide by these rules, and that includes the architectural guidelines." I smiled and pulled out my next document. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Bradley. The covenants are binding, but according to Section 1(3) of those same covenants, all HOA regulations must comply with local and state zoning laws. Let me read that to you directly." I cleared my throat and read the relevant passage, watching their expressions grow increasingly uncomfortable as the words sank in. "In cases where HOA regulations conflict with government zoning ordinances, the government regulations shall take precedence." Margaret was starting to look less smug and more irritated. "That's a technicality, Ms. Martinez. The spirit of the covenants is to maintain community standards, and your fence simply doesn't meet those standards." "Actually," I said, pulling out a thick stack of papers, "I think you'll find that cedar fencing not only meets local zoning standards, it's actually preferred under current environmental guidelines. The county's sustainable development policy, which was updated just 6 months ago, specifically encourages the use of cedar for residential applications due to its renewable properties and natural durability. End quote. I walked closer to their table and placed the county guidelines directly in front of Margaret. Furthermore, I've pulled the property records for this entire development, and I've found numerous examples of the HOA approving materials and modifications that aren't listed in the approved materials guidelines. The room was dead silent now. I could feel the attention of every resident focused on this exchange, and I knew that many of them had probably dealt with similar arbitrary enforcement of HOA rules over the years. Linda Porter looked up from her frantic note-taking. Even if there are some inconsistencies in past approvals, that doesn't change the fact that your fence wasn't submitted to the Architectural Review Committee for approval before installation. I had been waiting for this objection. That's an excellent point, Ms. Porter. Let me ask you this. Where in the covenants does it specify that residents must seek approval for improvements that comply with county zoning ordinances and don't require building permits? She flipped through her copy of the covenants, searching for the relevant section. After a few uncomfortable minutes, she looked up with a confused expression. Well, it's implied that all exterior modifications require approval. Implied isn't the same as explicitly stated, I replied. And since my fence is fully compliant with county zoning regulations and didn't require a building permit, I would argue that the approval process doesn't apply. Margaret was losing her patience. Ms. Martinez, you can quote regulations all you want, but the bottom line is that you violated community standards, and the fine stands. If you want to challenge it, you can take it up with our attorney. This was the moment I had been waiting for. I reached into my portfolio and pulled out my official zoning commissioner identification, placing it on the table where everyone could see it. Actually, Mrs. Whitman, I think there's something you should know about me before we go any further. I'm the newly elected zoning commissioner for this district. I was sworn in 3 weeks ago. Which means I have the authority to review and potentially override HOA regulations that conflict with county zoning ordinances. End quote. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Margaret's face went white. Tom Bradley's mouth fell open, and Linda Porter actually dropped her pen. The murmur that rippled through the room told me that the other residents were enjoying this revelation as much as I was. Furthermore, I continued, in my official capacity as zoning commissioner, I've been reviewing the enforcement patterns of homeowners associations throughout this district, and I have to say, Willowbrook Estates has caught my attention for all the wrong reasons. I pulled out another document, this one bearing the official county seal. This is a formal notice that I'm initiating a review of all HOA regulations in this development to ensure compliance with county and state zoning laws. Any fines or penalties issued for violations that don't actually violate government regulations will be considered null and void. End quote. Margaret found her voice, though it was considerably less confident than it had been 5 minutes earlier. You can't just come in here and invalidate our authority. This association has been operating under these covenants for nearly 20 years. You're right that I can't invalidate your authority, I agreed, but I can ensure that your authority is exercised within the bounds of actual law. The fact that you've been operating this way for 20 years doesn't give you the right to ignore zoning ordinances or selectively enforce your own rules. I turned to address the room full of residents, many of whom were leaning forward in their seats, clearly fascinated by this turn of events. How many of you have received fines or violations from this board for improvements that comply with county regulations? Nearly half the hands in the room went up. I wasn't surprised, but seeing the visual confirmation of what I had suspected was still satisfying. And how many of you have noticed that certain residents seem to get approval for modifications that others would be fined for? Even more hands went up this time, accompanied by some pointed looks toward the board members. I turned back to the board table. This is exactly the kind of arbitrary enforcement that prompted me to run for zoning commissioner in the first place. Property owners have rights, and those rights don't disappear just because they live in a development with an HOA. Tom Bradley tried to regain some authority. Even if you're the zoning commissioner, you still live in this community. You're still bound by the same covenants as everyone else. Absolutely, I agreed. But those covenants have to comply with the law. And when they don't, or when they're enforced in ways that violate residents' rights, that's when my office gets involved. I gathered my documents and prepared for my closing statement. Here's what's going to happen. The $2,500 fine against my property is being rescinded, effective immediately, because it was issued for a violation that doesn't actually violate any applicable regulations. Second, this board is going to conduct a comprehensive review of all fines and violations issued over the past 2 years to identify other cases of improper enforcement. Margaret started to protest, but I held up my hand. Third, the Architectural Review Committee is going to update its approved materials list to align with current county zoning guidelines and environmental standards. And finally, this board is going to implement transparent, consistent enforcement policies that treat all residents equally, regardless of personal relationships or board connections. The room erupted in applause. Clearly, I wasn't the only resident who had been frustrated with the board's heavy-handed approach to community management. If these changes aren't implemented within 60 days, I continued over the noise. I'll be recommending that the county initiate a formal investigation into HOA practices throughout this district, which could result in state oversight of all community associations in the area. I closed my portfolio and straightened my blazer. I moved to this community because I wanted to live somewhere peaceful and reasonable. I'm sure that's what most of us wanted. But peace doesn't come from arbitrary rules and selective enforcement. It comes from fair, consistent policies that respect everyone's rights. As I walked back to my seat, the applause continued, and I noticed several residents approaching the board table with what looked like their own copies of violation notices. Margaret, Tom, and Linda huddled together in what appeared to be a very intense whispered conversation. The meeting continued for another hour, but the tone had completely changed. Instead of the usual deference to board authority, residents began asking pointed questions about various enforcement decisions and requesting clarification on rules that seemed inconsistent or outdated. The board members, clearly rattled by my presentation, gave vague, unsatisfying answers that only seemed to fuel more questions. When the meeting finally ended, I was surrounded by neighbors who wanted to know more about the zoning review process and how they could challenge their own violations. Mrs. Chen, who lived 2 streets over, had been fined $300 for planting unapproved flowers in her front yard. Mr. Rodriguez had received a violation notice for parking his work truck in his own driveway overnight. But the Tell family had been threatened with legal action for installing solar panels that were supposedly the wrong color, despite the panels being designed to match their roof exactly. Each story reinforced my conviction that this board had been operating more like a homeowner's dictatorship than a legitimate community organization. But more importantly, each conversation gave me additional evidence for the comprehensive review I was planning to conduct. Over the next several weeks, I threw myself into the investigation with the kind of thoroughness that had made me successful in my previous planning jobs. I reviewed every violation notice issued by the Willowbrook HOA over the past 3 years, cross-referencing each one against county zoning regulations and state property laws. What I found was even worse than I had suspected. Nearly 40% of the violations were for issues that didn't actually violate any government regulations. Another 30% involved selective enforcement, where some residents were fined for modifications that had been approved for others. The remaining violations were legitimate, but many had been handled with disproportionate penalties that seemed designed more to generate revenue than to actually address community concerns. The pattern was clear and legally problematic. The HOA had been operating as if their covenants superseded actual law, issuing fines and threats for behavior that was perfectly legal under county and state regulations. Even worse, they had been doing it inconsistently, creating a system where board members and their friends could break rules with impunity, while other residents faced harsh penalties for minor infractions. Armed with this evidence, I drafted a comprehensive report that I submitted to both the county attorney's office and the state commission that oversees homeowners associations. But I didn't stop there. The more I researched, the more I realized that Willowbrook wasn't unique. HOAs throughout our region were engaged in similar practices, creating a patchwork of arbitrary rules that often conflicted with actual property law. That's when I decided to introduce legislation. As a zoning commissioner, I had the authority to propose changes to county development policies, but I also had connections throughout the state planning community that I had built over my 15-year career. I began working with colleagues in other districts to draft a comprehensive HOA reform bill that would establish clear limits on community association authority and create oversight mechanisms to prevent the kind of abuses I had documented. The bill, which we called the Property Rights Protection Act, included several key provisions. First, it required all HOA regulations to be consistent with local zoning ordinances, with automatic invalidation of any conflicting rules. Second, it established standardized enforcement procedures that required documented evidence and consistent application across all residents. Third, it created a state-level appeals process for residents who felt they had been unfairly targeted by their HOAs. Most importantly, the bill included provisions for financial penalties against HOA boards that engaged in discriminatory or arbitrary enforcement practices. Boards that were found to have violated residents' rights could face fines of up to $10,000 per incident, with repeat offenders subject to state oversight or even dissolution. The legislative process took 6 months, during which I testified before 3 different committees and worked with attorneys from the State Homeowners' Rights Organization to address concerns about implementation. End quote. Enforcement. The real estate industry initially opposed the bill, arguing that it would undermine property values and community standards. But as more stories emerged about HOA abuses throughout the state, public opinion shifted dramatically in favor of reform. The bill passed the state legislature in April with bipartisan support, and the governor signed it into law in May. When it took effect on July 1st, it immediately impacted thousands of homeowners associations across the state, requiring them to review and revise their enforcement practices to comply with the new standards. But the real satisfaction came from watching the changes in my own community. Within 2 months of my confrontation at the board meeting, all 3 board members had resigned, citing changed circumstances and new priorities. The residents elected a new board that included 2 of the people who had been unfairly fined under the old regime. The new board's first official act was to rescind all violations that had been issued for improvements that complied with county zoning regulations. Mrs. Chaim got her $300 back and was officially permitted to keep her beautiful flower garden. Mr. Rodriguez was allowed to park his work truck in his own driveway. The Patel family's solar panels were retroactively approved, and they received a written apology for the months of harassment they had endured. My cedar fence, of course, was officially recognized as a beautiful and appropriate addition to the community that enhanced, rather than detracted from property values. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was watching how the community itself began to change. Without the constant threat of arbitrary fines and violations, residents began to take more pride in their properties and more interest in community activities. The monthly board meetings, which had previously been poorly attended exercises in authoritarian rulemaking, became genuine forums for discussing community improvements and addressing legitimate concerns. The new board established working committees for landscaping, community events, and infrastructure maintenance, giving residents actual input into decisions that affected their daily lives. They revised the architectural review process to focus on safety and compliance with actual regulations rather than subjective aesthetic preferences. Most importantly, they created a transparent appeals process that ensured all residents were treated fairly and consistently. 1 year after that fateful HOA meeting, I was re-elected as zoning commissioner by the largest margin in district history. My campaign focused on the success of the Property Rights Protection Act and my commitment to ensuring that local government worked for residents rather than against them. The support I received from homeowners throughout the district, many of whom had their own HOA horror stories, demonstrated how widespread these problems had been and how hungry people were for reasonable solutions. The Willowbrook Estates development became a model for how HOAs could operate effectively within the bounds of actual law while still maintaining community standards and property values. Property values and the development actually increased after the reforms, as potential buyers were attracted to a community that promised reasonable governance and respect for property rights. My chickens, now numbering 8 after I added 2 more hens to the flock, continued to thrive behind their beautiful cedar fence. Every morning when I collected eggs and watched them scratch contentedly in their secure run, I was reminded of how a simple desire to protect something I cared about had led to systematic change that benefited thousands of people. The fence itself had weathered to a gorgeous silver gray that complemented the mature landscaping perfectly. Neighbors often commented on how attractive it was, and several had installed similar cedar fencing around their own properties. The approved materials list now included cedar, along with dozens of other options that reflected current market availability and environmental considerations. But the real victory wasn't about the fence, or even about the legislation. It was about the principle that property owners have fundamental rights that can't be arbitrarily taken away by self-appointed community authorities. It was about the importance of challenging unjust systems, even when it would be easier to just pay the fine and move on. And it was about using whatever power and expertise you have to make positive change, not just for yourself, but for everyone who faces similar challenges. Looking back, I realized that opening that letter with the $2,500 fine was one of the best things that ever happened to me. It forced me to confront a system that had been operating in the shadows, using intimidation and bureaucratic complexity to suppress property rights and democratic participation. It gave me the opportunity to use my professional knowledge and newly elected authority to create lasting change that extended far beyond my own backyard. The HOA Karen who thought she could bully me with an arbitrary fine had no idea that she was picking a fight with someone who had both the expertise and the official authority to fight back. But more than that, she had no idea that her actions would ultimately lead to statewide legislation that would protect thousands of other homeowners from the same kind of harassment and abuse. Every time I look at my cedar fence, I'm reminded that sometimes the most important battles are fought over things that seem small and personal. A fence to protect chickens became a symbol of property rights and democratic governance. A $2,500 fine became the catalyst for comprehensive legal reform. And a suburban homeowners dispute became a lesson in how individual citizens can create systemic change when they refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. The chickens, blissfully unaware of the legal and political drama that had swirled around their cedar-protected home, continued to provide fresh eggs and gentle entertainment. But they had also, in their own way, become agents of change, proving that sometimes the most powerful movements start with the simple desire to protect something precious. As I write this story, the Property Rights Protection Act has been in effect for over 2 years, and its impact continues to ripple through communities across the state. Other states have begun introducing similar legislation, and homeowners' rights organizations have used our law as a model for their own reform efforts. What started as one woman's fight against an unfair fence fine has become part of a national conversation about property rights, local governance, and the balance between community standards and individual freedom. The lesson, I suppose, is that you never know who you're dealing with when you decide to abuse your authority. That suburban mom with the chicken coop might just be the newly elected zoning commissioner with the knowledge, connections, and determination to turn your petty power grab into a teachable moment for the entire state. And that $2,500 fine might just be the spark that ignites a movement for justice that changes thousands of lives for the better. My cedar fence still stands, weathered and beautiful, protecting my chickens and serving as a daily reminder that sometimes the most important victories come from refusing to back down when you know you're right. The HOA Karen who tried to fine me learned a valuable lesson about picking battles with people whose authority extends far beyond her suburban fiefdom. And I learned that the power to create change often lies dormant until the moment when injustice forces you to use it. In the end, we all got what we deserved. The chickens got their protection, the community got fair governance, the state got better laws, and I got the satisfaction of knowing that standing up for principle can create ripple effects that extend far beyond anything you originally imagined. Not bad for a dispute that started with a fence and some hens who just wanted to scratch in peace. The real test of the new prey. Legislation came 18 months later when I received a phone call that would prove just how far-reaching the changes had become. It was from Jennifer Walsh, a reporter with the State Tribune, who was working on a feature story about HOA reform across the region. "Commissioner Martinez," she said, her voice carrying the excitement of someone who had stumbled onto a bigger story than she expected. "I've been tracking the implementation of the Property Rights Protection Act, and the numbers are remarkable. Do you have time to discuss what's been happening since the law took effect?" I cleared my schedule for the interview, curious to hear her findings. When she arrived at my office the following afternoon, she brought with her a thick folder of documents and a laptop filled with data that painted a picture of transformation I hadn't fully grasped from my position inside. The process. In the first year alone, Jennifer explained, spreading charts across my conference table, the state received over 3,000 complaints against homeowners associations. But here's what's interesting. After the initial flood of cases, complaint numbers dropped by 60%. It appears that most HOAs got the message and reformed their practices voluntarily rather than face state intervention. The statistics were encouraging, but what really caught my attention were the individual stories she had collected during her research. A veteran in Oakville had been grayed, fighting a 5-year battle with his HOA over a flagpole in his front yard. The association had claimed the pole violated height restrictions, despite it being fully compliant with federal laws protecting veterans' rights to display the American flag. Under the new legislation, his case was resolved in 2 weeks, with the HOA not only allowing the flagpole but issuing a formal apology. In Riverside County, an elderly couple had been facing foreclosure over unpaid fines for lawn violations that occurred while the husband was undergoing cancer treatment. The new appeals process revealed that the violations had been issued inconsistently, with other residents receiving warnings for identical issues while this couple faced immediate fines. The foreclosure proceedings were stopped, the fines were waived, and the HOA board was required to undergo training on fair enforcement practices. Most significantly, Jennifer had identified a pattern of HOA boards voluntarily updating their covenants and governance procedures to align with the new standards, often going beyond the minimum requirements to create more collaborative relationships with their residents. The law created a framework, Jennifer observed, but what seems to be happening is a cultural shift in how these communities operate. People are talking to each other instead of sending violation notices. Boards are asking for input instead of making unilateral decisions. She showed me data from property value analyses that contradicted every argument the real estate industry had made against the legislation. Communities that had reformed their HOA practices under the new law showed stronger property value growth than those in areas without similar protections. Buyer surveys indicated that transparent, fair governance had become a significant selling point, with many people specifically seeking homes in communities that operated under the reformed standards. "There's something else," Jennifer said, pulling out a map of the state marked with different colored pins. "I've been tracking where the most significant changes have occurred, and there's a clear pattern. Communities that had the most problems before the law was passed have shown the most dramatic improvements afterward." The map told a story of transformation that extended well beyond individual disputes over fences and landscaping. Entire neighborhoods had evolved from antagonistic relationships between boards and residents to collaborative partnerships focused on genuine community improvement. But perhaps the most unexpected development was the emergence of what Jennifer called best practices networks. Among reformed HOAs, boards that had successfully navigated the transition to compliance with the new law were sharing their experiences and strategies with other communities, creating an informal support system that was accelerating positive change throughout the state. "It's become almost like a movement," Jennifer explained. "These board members and community leaders are talking at regional meetings, sharing templates for fair policies, and even helping residents in other areas understand their rights under the new law." The interview gave me a perspective on the legislation's impact that I couldn't have gained from my role as zoning commissioner. While I dealt with individual cases and enforcement issues, Jennifer had captured the broader transformation that was occurring across hundreds of communities and affecting thousands of families. After she left, I found myself reflecting on how one confrontation over a cedar fence had ultimately contributed to this widespread change in how residential communities operated. The legislation had created the ball framework, but the real power was in how people chose to use that framework to build better relationships and more democratic processes. That evening, I walked out to check on my chickens, a ritual that had remained constant through all the legal and political upheaval of the past few years. The 8 hens were settling in for the night, their soft clucking creating a peaceful soundtrack to my thoughts. The cedar fence had aged beautifully, its weathered surface now hosting climbing jasmine that added both privacy and fragrance to the space. As I collected the day's eggs, I thought about all the other families across the state who were probably having similar peaceful moments in their own backyards. No longer worried about arbitrary fines or selective enforcement of rules they had no voice in creating. The legislation had given them something precious: the right to enjoy their homes without fear of capricious authority. The following month brought another unexpected development. The Property Rights Protection Act had caught the attention of legislators in 3 neighboring states, who invited me to testify at their committee hearings on similar proposed legislation. The opportunity to share our experience and help other states avoid the problems we had identified was both humbling and energizing. The first hearing was in the state capital of our eastern neighbor, where I found myself in a packed legislative chamber facing questions from lawmakers who were clearly dealing with their own constituents' HOA horror stories. Committee chairman opened the session by reading letters from residents who had been fined for everything from wrong-colored mailbox posts to unauthorized bird feeders. "Commissioner Martinez," he said, leaning forward with the intensity of someone who had clearly heard these complaints many times, "can you walk us through how your legislation has actually changed day-to-day life for homeowners in these communities?" I had prepared extensively for this question, bringing with me not just statistics and legal analysis, but stories from residents whose lives had been directly impacted by the reforms. I told them about the veterans' flagpole, the elderly couple facing foreclosure, and dozens of other cases where the law had provided relief from arbitrary enforcement. But I also shared something more personal: the story of Mrs. Patterson, an elderly widow in my own community who had been living in fear of her HOA for over a decade. She had received so many violation notices for minor issues like the height of her grass or the color of her flower pots that she had stopped gardening entirely, letting her once beautiful yard deteriorate rather than risk another fine. After our reforms, I told the committee, Mrs. Patterson began gardening again. Not because the rules changed dramatically, but because she finally felt safe to enjoy her property without constant fear of punishment. That's what good governance looks like, when people feel empowered to improve their homes and communities rather than just survive them. The hearing lasted 4 hours, with lawmakers asking detailed questions about implementation challenges, enforcement mechanisms, and the economic impact of the reforms. By the end of the session, it was clear that they were serious about adapting our model to their own state's needs. Over the following year, I testified at similar hearings in 2 additional states and consulted with legislative drafting committees in 4 others. Each state faced unique challenges based on their existing property laws and regulatory structures, but the core principles remained consistent: transparency, fairness, and respect for fundamental property rights. The experience of helping other states develop their own versions of HOA reform legislation taught me valuable lessons about the complexity of creating systemic change. What had started as a local solution to a specific problem had evolved into a broader movement that required careful attention to different legal frameworks, political climates, and community needs. But the most rewarding aspect of this expanded role was hearing from residents in other states who were finally finding relief from years of HOA harassment and abuse. A teacher in Colorado who had been fighting a 3-year battle over solar panels on her roof. A small business owner in Arizona whose HOA had tried to prevent him from parking his clearly labeled work van in his own driveway. A military family in Nevada who had faced fines every time they were deployed because they couldn't maintain their lawn to arbitrary standards while serving overseas. Each story reinforced my conviction that the work we had started was about more than just regulatory reform. It was about restoring the basic dignity and security that should come with homeownership. The success of the multi-state HOA reform movement also attracted attention from national homeowners' rights organizations, leading to invitations to speak at conferences and participate in policy discussions at the federal level. While I maintained my focus on local and state issues, these connections provided valuable insights into how similar problems were manifesting across the entire country. The most significant of these opportunities came when the Department of Housing and Urban Development invited me to participate in a federal task force examining the role of homeowners associations in affordable housing policy. The 6-month assignment required me to take a partial leave from my zoning commissioner duties. But the chance to influence national housing policy was too important to pass up. The task force brought together representatives from academia, the real estate industry, consumer advocacy groups, and government at all levels. Our mandate was to examine how HOA practices were affecting housing affordability and access, particularly for first-time buyers and historically marginalized communities. What we discovered during our research phase was both troubling and illuminating. In many markets, HOA fees and potential fines had become significant barriers to homeownership, particularly for buyers with limited financial resources. More concerning was evidence that some associations were using their regulatory authority to exclude certain types of residents through discriminatory enforcement of rules about things like occupancy limits, vehicle restrictions, and architectural standards. The task force's final report included 23 specific recommendations for federal, state, and local action to address these issues. While I was proud of our comprehensive analysis and thoughtful policy proposals, I was even more satisfied to see that many of our recommendations built directly on the reforms we had implemented through the Property Rights Protection Act. The report's release generated significant media attention and sparked congressional hearings on HOA regulation and oversight. While federal legislation moves slowly, the increased visibility of these issues created political pressure for action at all levels of government. Meanwhile, back home, the practical effects of our reforms continued to evolve in ways that surprised and pleased me. The most notable development was the emergence of what residents began calling community councils in several neighborhoods throughout our district. These councils were informal groups of residents who worked collaboratively with their HOA boards to address community issues before they became enforcement problems. Instead of waiting for violation notices, neighbors were proactively communicating about property maintenance, architectural modifications, and community standards. The council in my own neighborhood had become particularly effective at mediating disputes and facilitating compromise solutions that satisfied both individual property rights and legitimate community interests. When the Hendersons wanted to install a hot tub that required variance from standard setback requirements, the council helped them work with neighbors to address privacy and noise concerns before submitting their application to the board. When the new family on Elm Street needed to install a wheelchair ramp that didn't conform to standard architectural guidelines, the council connected them with contractors who could design a solution that met accessibility needs while complementing the home's existing appearance. These collaborative approaches were producing outcomes that were more creative and satisfactory than the old system of rigid rule enforcement had ever achieved. People felt heard and respected, which made them more willing to work within community standards rather than fight against them. The success of these grassroots innovations reinforced my belief that the most important aspect of our legal reforms was not the specific rules they established, but the democratic processes they encouraged. When people have genuine input into the decisions that affect their lives, they invest in making those decisions work for everyone. As I approach the end of my second term as zoning commissioner, I often reflect on the unexpected journey that began with a $2,500 fine for a cedar fence. What started as a personal dispute about protecting my chickens evolved into comprehensive legal reform that has improved life for thousands of families across multiple states. The fence itself remains exactly where Miguel and his crew installed it years ago, now completely integrated into the mature landscape of my backyard. The cedar has weathered to a soft gray that changes color subtly with the seasons and weather conditions. The jasmine that climbs along its length blooms twice a year, filling the space with fragrance that my chickens seem to enjoy as much as I do. The flock has grown to 12 hens now, representing 4 different breeds that provide eggs in various sizes and colors. Each morning's collection yields a rainbow of browns, blues, and greens that never fails to delight me. The chickens themselves have become minor celebrities in the neighborhood, with children often stopping by to watch them through the fence and learn about where eggs actually come from. But beyond the personal satisfaction of protecting my small urban farm, the fence has become a symbol of something larger. The principle that reasonable people can create reasonable solutions when they approach problems with good faith and respect for each other's rights. The HOA board that once seemed so intimidating and arbitrary has been replaced by neighbors who understand that community leadership is about service, not power. The monthly meetings that used to be exercises in authoritarian rulemaking have become genuine forums for democratic participation and collaborative problem-solving. The architectural review process that once seemed designed to frustrate and penalize residents now operates as a resource for helping people improve their properties in ways that benefit both individual Baying Rye, families, and the broader community. The approved materials list that once excluded cedar now includes dozens of options that reflect current environmental standards and market availability. Most importantly, the culture of fear and resentment that once characterized relationships between the board and residents has been replaced by a spirit of cooperation and mutual respect. People talk to each other instead of sending violation notices. Problems are addressed through communication and compromise rather than fines and threats. The transformation has been so complete that it's sometimes hard to remember how dysfunctional things used to be. New residents moving into the community are often surprised to learn about the old system, finding it difficult to believe that their neighbors once lived under such arbitrary and punitive governance. The success of our local reforms, combined with the broader legislative changes we helped inspire, has created a model that continues to influence policy discussions throughout the region and beyond. While I'm proud of the role I played in initiating these changes, I'm even more proud of how the community itself has embraced and extended the principles of fair governance and democratic participation. As I prepare to step down from my role as zoning commissioner to focus on other projects, I know that the systems we put in place are strong enough to continue evolving and improving without my direct involvement. The real measure of successful reform is not whether it requires constant oversight from its creators, but whether it becomes self-sustaining through the commitment of the people it serves. The cedar fence that started this whole journey will outlast my tenure in office, continuing to protect whatever chickens I choose to keep, and serving as a reminder that sometimes the most important battles are fought over things that seem small and personal. But those battles, when fought with principle and persistence, can create changes that extend far beyond their original scope and continue to benefit people for generations to come.